Good afternoon, evening, I guess for some of you. It's really late evening. And welcome to Storytime with Max. And there's Max. So, there's not much intro to give. As long as you can hear me and the sound sounds good, we will jump right into some of you in UTC time, GMT time, probably right for bed. So you can hear a lovely story before you go to sleep, which I don't think is too awfully scary tonight.
There are some scary parts.
Okay. All right.
Depending on your definition of scary. Alright, so tonight we are reading The Becoming Luchorpan, our beloved short little race of the TDD. I don't know if I am pronouncing these guys anywhere close to correctly, but I'm doing my best. We'll see how much we get through. Hopefully we'll find a good place to end at 7 our time. So, without further ado, The Becoming Luchorpan. Oh, and of course, I have my reading buddy here, so it's very convenient. The craggy-faced little man blew puffs of smoke into the heavy-scented air of the forest. His dark eyes slid around the dimly lit clearing, taking in the eager faces all around. The young folk appeared to be attentive to their elder, and he almost nodded approvingly. But then he grew suspicious. They were too well-behaved, too eager for the story. The old Luchorpan watched them cannily. Something was definitely off, though the children appeared to be staring at him wide-eyed. He could hear giggling, rattling, and even the occasional suppressed shriek. From experience, he could guess the rest. Under a barely maintained illusion of stillness, the young Luchorpan were jumping up and dashing back and forth to play tricks. Stealing things, mussing hair, spitballing, jolting each other with sparks, and generally having a laugh. The old Luchorpan coughed, annoyed, and tapped out the dead ash in his pipe against the stone he sat upon. It was time to make some clever guesses. "You there, young Lurigadani, put down those swords and wands this instant. And Kluri, stop pickpocketing those other fellows and join us now. Gather round, young tricksters. It's time you heard the story." The illusion rippled and disappeared, revealing the disorganized group staring at him, open-mouthed. The old Luchorpan could hardly contain a chuckle of his own. The tops of the trees rustled in the wind and seemed to lean forward in anticipation as the elder took another long pull on his pipe, waiting for the young folk to settle down. He glared at them for quiet. Some of the youngsters listened, but a few still shimmered blue in his sight. It seemed the children, who had gotten pranked, were turning to their revenge now. He gave them his best disapproving glare. However, a shock of fear went through the old man's chest as he saw the eldest child draw a knife from his pocket and brandish it with a foul expression. "Stop!" cried the elder. Anger flashed the old Luchorpan's face as he leaned forward on the rock, struggling to get the knife wielder's attention. "So, it's a bit of a fight you'll be wanting to remind you of your place, then? Have you forgotten all my lessons? Is that the way of it?" He stared until the boy lowered the knife and sat down with a crimson face. "You should not be so angry at a little trick like that," he added, sitting up straight. "The way you handle yourself, especially when mischief is afoot, says everything about who you are. Don't let your anger overwhelm you, or you'll be fighting family in a moment." The boy sat down, chastised. As soon as his teacher turned away, however, the youngster stuck out his tongue and made an insolent gesture. He kept his fist closed around the knife handle. "Then 'tis a fight you'll be having!" The elder reached behind him and pulled out a staff scarred by long use. The juvenile Luchorpan glanced at each other in alarm. The youngest among them stood and raised his hand for attention. He puffed himself up to his full 2.5-foot height and proclaimed, in his high voice, "I call upon you, my fellow Luchorpan. We have all suffered many hard knocks from our teacher. Let this be a day of reckoning. Let this be a day of vengeance. Let this be the day we got a bit of our own back. We're ready for you, old one. We know all of your tricks. Today we repay you in full." Rather than let their companion get his revenge alone, the youngsters rose from their seats and smiled darkly as they counted their numbers, 6 in all. That should be more than enough to overcome the white-haired Luchorpan. They too drew their weapons, a wide array of gnarled staves, curved wands, and leaf-shaped practice swords. In return, the elder smiled deeply. "'Tis true we have fought many a fine duel, yet I have one old trick, a very old trick indeed, which I have saved for this very day." At that, the confidence of the youngest ones wavered a little, but not that of the eldest boy, who had followed suit and sheathed his knife only to draw a padded club. "Words don't scare us. You heard what Clury said. We're more than prepared for whatever deviltry you've cooked up." "Are you now?" replied the elder, with a nasty twinkle in his eye. "Then prepare yourselves. I'm going to give you a demonstration of real Luchorpan magic. Ahinboya!" he bellowed, and then nodded, almost imperceptibly. The young folk tensed, then looked at one another in confusion. It was a strange language to them, one they had never heard. Was it a new spell? Looking at the elder, they saw no sign of him summoning magic. "Is this a trick, old one?" said the oldest boy scornfully, calling up as much bravado as he could muster. "Or have you lost your powers along with your wits?" The elder sat down again and grinned. "I'm not that old yet. If you were my age, you would know that I just told you to look behind you." With bushy eyebrows raised quizzically, the 6 youngsters turned around to see 6 older boys creeping up behind them with heavy sticks raised. The rebellious youngsters gaped in astonishment as 6 staves came crashing down. Thwack! The young challengers sat down hard, feeling bumps rise on their chastised heads. The elder smiled as he lit a new bowl, puffing clouds of smoke. "Young ones, magic is not the only way to trick someone. Now, who wishes to start the recitation?" Smiling weakly as he stood once again, Clury began to speak in a sing-song voice. I am not going to do the whole thing in sing-song, don't worry. "Long before the second breaking of the world, there once lived a pair of children in a house on a hill, a brother and sister named Gadai and Anga. Their parents had died or disappeared long ago. Gadai was sibling and parent to his much younger sister, though he would often disappear for hours during the day, while she played in the weedy garden. This was because Gadai would go into the town at the bottom of the hill and steal what they needed. He was slippery, quick, and his child's fingers were clever enough to pluck a purse as soft as a breeze. He was very good, perhaps already one of the greatest thieves of his time. Everyone in town knew his profession, but they never caught him. Besides, it was clear that Gadai followed a strict moral code. First, he only stole from the wealthier folk in town, or the occasional well-heeled visitor, who could well afford the loss. Second, he restrained himself, and took no more than what he and his sister needed to survive. Finally, Anga insisted that they always share with others truly in need, and Gadai was happy to oblige. The other orphan children in the town were never turned away when they climbed the hill and asked for bread. Godai soon felt like a parent to all of them, and Anga somehow always knew what was most needed for help. The townsfolk at the bottom of the hill even put up with his occasional pranks and tricks. They laughed when they discovered that their laundry had been switched with the neighbors, or jokes had been painted on the side of the well. The townsfolk let him carve out a living, and he and Anga were happy. The years passed, and the children grew. Godai became a man, growing tall and straight, with long limbs. Anga said she was glad of that, as he could hug her tightly when she needed to draw on his strength to supplement her own. Anga was on the cusp of adulthood herself when the signs of the first Veilstorm came. Everyone in the village felt the pressure in the air, the thrumming of the storm gathering its power to strike their area. She and Godai watched at the window, wide-eyed at the flashing lightning and the pelting rain. The wind tore at the earth in gusts, and the thunder seemed loud enough to crack stone. Buildings in the village shook to pieces, and the storm battered, changed, or killed many of the newly defenseless folk. When the sun rose the next day, its warm light shone on a scene of chaos, as a great deal of damage had been done. Folk mourned their friends, families, and everything that had made their village beautiful, as they tried to pick up the pieces. Up on the hill, Godai and Anga's house still stood, untouched. Not a single tile in the roof had come loose. They had been very lucky. And the pair invited several desperate folk to live in their house while the rest of the town was rebuilt. That same year, another storm loomed over the town. Certain that the house had been spared by previous storms, only for a more terrible retribution now, the superstitious folk staying with Godai and Anga fled into the twilight. Once again, the winds of magic tore furiously at the town and its terrified people. And once again, the house on the hill was untouched. Wonder turned into suspicion and jealousy in the following year, when more storms came and went without damaging Godai and Anga's home. Godai let up on his thievery and pranks, but it didn't make any difference. Many of the townsfolk stopped speaking to him and Anga. Godai threw himself into helping the dispossessed, the starving, and especially the children in need. One day, a powerful wind picked up. Scuds of clouds ran across the sky, fleeing the terrible wrath of a storm. The sky groaned as though in pain. This was no average Veilstorm. A malevolence gathered power. Instead of preparing for the oncoming storm, many of the homeless townsfolk had gathered in one of the few pubs left standing, swilling ale and trading survival stories. As the pressure in the air grew to an unbearable level, the malevolence rolled in overhead. A wave of emotion washed over the crowd like a flood. The storm seemed to encourage their dark tempers, aiding the ale in their blood and bringing the mob to a fever pitch of anger. They spilled into the street, voices raised in a clamor for justice. Who started it, no one ever knew. But many of them took up the cry that thieves had stolen their luck. Blackguards in league with dark forces above. Former victims of Godai's tricks blamed their misfortunes on him and shouted that the man in the house on the hill should suffer as they had all suffered. In their storm-fogged minds, they clung to the vague notion that inflicting pain on Godai would ease their own. Wrapping sticks in alcohol-soaked rags for makeshift torches, the mob set off through the pre-storm quiet, calling hoarsely through the town for others to join them. Waving broken glasses and flaming shards of wood, many caught the scent of blood in the air and joined them. They were taken with a mad panic, thinking this was the last act before the storm ended everything. From a distance, their angry procession formed a stream of fire that quickly spread up the path toward G'day and Anga's humble home, one of the last houses still standing in the township. Among the mob were many of those who had received help from the siblings on the hill. In their anger and their fear, all kindness was forgotten. It was unmistakably time to leave. G'day grabbed Anga's arm and she grabbed the basket from the pantry and her walking stick. They fled out the back door as the angry mob stormed to the front door. The mob's blood was up, hearkening back to the way their ancestors had once stormed the castles of their oppressors. The little house on the hill was far from a grand castle. Within moments, the mob had busted through one of the walls, and flames began licking along the edges of the roof. Anga looked back as she hustled ahead of G'day, and he saw the flickering reflections in her eyes. They could hear the townsfolk's rage, cursing and clamoring with one voice that G'day and Anga give up the secret of their safety. The house was clearly empty, but it made no difference. The pair knew no secrets. They had simply been lucky. Desperate, G'day and Anga ran through the gathering rain, stumbling through the mud and wet grass, seeking shelter from the implacable storm. The hills rose up before them, but Anga guided her brother to a cave, where she had stored herbs to dry. They both knew the shelter would do little against the Veilstorm, but at least it was warmer, out of the rain. Inside the shallow cave, they dropped their burdens and sat on the cold stone, watching the rain increase in violence outside. The storm growled with thunder, though no lightning had yet struck nearby. G'day seethed in turn, scowling out the open cave mouth. What was the point of it all, Anga? I feel like a fool for helping them. What thanks is this? Why did we ever go hungry just to feed them? I will return their cruelty tenfold. For emphasis, he spat into the rain. Anga smiled sadly at him. It is only fear and weakness, G'day. You have done many foolish things, no doubt. That helping others in need was not one of them. Calm yourself. If you waste time seeking revenge, it will only stop us from finding a new home. G'day could not help smiling back, though it was a strained smile. You shield your heart from the anger that overtakes me. I'd be lost without the kindness you were named for, and so would they. As the storm raged outside, its fearful roar made it clear that this was no ordinary Veilstorm. It was a malevolence, terrifying to behold in its power and intensity. Stones cracked and split outside the cave, as lightning poured down out of the sky like a waterfall of white fire. The pressure of the air, heavy with furious magic, increased in force even as the temperature dropped. Cold winds descended on the town, leveling the buildings and the trees, and everything else for miles around, including the former home of G'day and his sister. The malevolence howled louder, roiling the heavens with terrible power, as if delighting in the pitiful cries of the creatures below. Its freezing fury whipped across the landscape, tearing at the earth. Thrumming power filled the cave, where G'day and Anga now huddled close together. A pricking, scraping sensation crept over G'day's skin, and he felt Anga's body stiffen in fear next to him. There was a presence in the wind-blasted cave, a feeling of change and shaping. Chaotic forces of wind and magic tore at their bodies, and Anga cried out in pain, "Gadai, something's happening to me." He threw his arms around his sister and hugged her close to his chest, hoping to somehow shield her body with his own. Eavesdropping during his exploits, Gadai had heard of storms that turned folk into monsters. He knew it was the change, but he had no power to stop it. "Hold on to me," he cried, desperate. "No, no, no, take me instead." Anga's body began to shake with the beginnings of the change. Distantly, screams and howls from the top of the hill told Gadai that others were suffering the same fate. But only one person truly mattered to him. Gadai hugged his sister tightly, but she only shook with greater violence. She screamed when she realized what was happening, and the storm roared its thunder in return, slamming the countryside with sound. Anga's flesh rippled as the horrible magic pulsed through her body. Her back arched in pain, and her scream cut off as the first wave of change overtook Gadai's little sister. He held on tight, even as her fingers were stretched into claws that raked at his arms, drawing blood. Her teeth became long and sharp as she reflexively bit into his shoulder. Gadai refused to let go even as her legs grew horns and scales, twisting to kick at him as a tail curled around his neck. He told her he loved her, even as the abomination that had been Anga ripped him off of itself and snarled. It rolled on the ground as tentacles burst from its flesh and waved stingers in the air while the storm thundered triumphantly above. It sounded to Gadai like booming laughter, mocking their helplessness in the face of the horror. The creature stared up at him from the floor of the cave. Gadai prayed to God, the storm itself, and to the old gods of his people, to anyone that would listen, to stop the change. For a moment longer, the thing still had Anga's eyes, weeping as she looked up from the sandy floor of the cave. Then, as the pressure swelled, the eyes began to change as well, swelling and shifting to an evil yellow. Gadai gritted his teeth against the tears that pressed against his eyes and dropped to his knees. He cradled the abomination's misshapen, bulbous head, the way he had cradled Anga's perfect one when she was a baby. The writhing creature that had been his sister hissed and growled. Gadai knew he couldn't hesitate a moment longer, for the abomination would swiftly grow in power and size. Hands shaking, Gadai drew his knife from the sheath on his leg. Tenderly, gingerly, he cut the creature's throat. It wasn't his sister anymore. The storm had killed her. As blood gushed to meet the puddles forming on the cave floor, a voice whispered, "I will always love you." They must have been his own words. When all the life had left her body, he laid her head down, arranging her clawed and tentacled limbs in an unnatural posture of rest. Mad with pain and loss, Gadai walked out into the storm, screaming into the sky as he choked on the cold rain. Change me too, damn you! I dare you! I defy you, malevolence! Or if you will not, I call upon all the powers to grant me my revenge." After what seemed like hours, the lightning ceased, and the rumbling of thunder began to die away as the malevolence dissipated. When the malevolence ended, he was still Gadai. However, as he dried his eyes and looked to the horizon, he felt slightly different. In what way, he could not have said. Time passed. The darkness gathered in Godai's mind, a miasma of rage and hurt. He was unable to think clearly. His sister was gone, taken by the storm and put to rest by his own hand, and without her he was lost. He could not hurt the storm, and so he blamed the folk he had once helped, who had turned on him and burnt his house in their fear and confusion. The darkness filled him, and the only way he could make an aperture, an opening for himself to exist in the thick swamp of revenge that infested his mind, like an endless swarm of gnats, was to seek vengeance. He could not see the storm's face. He could only desire to see their faces, distraught and destroyed, as they had done to him. He never considered that the storm might have changed Anga no matter what the townsfolk had done. Godai tried to satisfy his need for revenge. He stole from the townsfolk as never before, not for anyone's benefit, even his own. He took everything they had, from the rich and the poor alike, as punishment for their cruelty and ingratitude. Instead of sharing his loot, he hid the great fortune away in the earth, in a cave far from the one he and Anga had shared. He could never go back there. And that seems like the place to stop for now. You can
have sweet dreams!
Sweet dreams, everybody.
You're evil. You're so evil.
No, it's I guess I wouldn't call it scary so much as very sad.
Very sad.
But do not despair. It's not all sadness in the latter half of the story, the next half of the story. You can go on our website and go to the lore page and cheer yourself up by finding out what happens later on.
Here we go. Lore page for you guys.
Yes.
So you can immediately...
By reading the
Luchorpan
read the Becoming story.
Ending. Can't end that way.
But that's all the time we have for this evening. So thank you very much for listening and watching. And I'll see you next time.
Yes.
And I don't know what we have planned for streaming tomorrow, but I'm sure it's excellent.
Yeah, 10:30 a.m. There's Tea with Genesee, and we have
Genesee.
Piercing the Veil. And
Piercing the Veil. Get your questions in. Mark will
a bunch of things.
do some responses.
Here, I'll put the schedule in for those of you who don't know.
Yeah, drop the schedule in chat, and
so come back tomorrow at 10:30, and we'll hang out with you again. All right, everyone, have a great evening. Thanks for being with us today.
good evening. Bye-bye.